Parshat Noach makes for dark reading in the best of days. And all flesh perished. All that creeps upon the earth, the birds and the land animals of varying sorts, and all that slithers upon the land, and all of humanity. And of course, Parshat Noach is our Parshat HaShavua, and so we have to deal with it. It's, in some regard, some would argue, elements of it at least, are our Parshat Hashanah. So much uncertainty, so much of a sense of a world that, in certain regards, feels at times as if it is teetering on the brink. A society always has stories that it tells itself. Much of our society has for centuries understood the story of Noach and the Teva in a certain way. And yet, within the last 20 years, I want to share with you, by way of contrast, the story of Noach, in order to understand the story of Noach better and hopefully in a deeper way. Two stories that are notable because they both won major prizes for literature. The first is called The Road. It was written in 2006. It won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction in 2007. Cormac McCarthy in this book talks about a father and a son who are walking along some kind of a road, as the title implies. We're not even sure where they're going. It's not clear that they're sure where they're going. We never learn what the apocalypse is or why it happened, but McCarthy treats us to vivid descriptions of a world turned to ashes and cinder. The two, father and son, hiding, cowering under plastic tarps when it rains, and pushing a shopping cart with a squeaky wheel filled with the last of their possessions and some meager rations, avoiding others along the road, lest someone try to steal their possessions, or God forbid, steal the boy away from his father, or worse. And there's even an alternate rendering in McCarthy's view of what the world reverting back to chaos means. Perhaps in the world's destruction, he writes, it would be possible at last to see how it was made. Oceans, mountains, the ponderous counter-spectacle of things ceasing to be. The sweeping waste, hydroptic and coldly secular. The silence. Now, this book is not entirely secular. There's a relationship here and there, intermittently, with Hashem. There's great anger against God. Here's McCarthy again, describing. He woke before dawn and watched the gray day break, slow and half opaque. He rose while the boy slept and pulled on his shoes, and wrapped in his blanket, he walked out through the trees. He descended into a grate in the stone, and there he crouched, coughing, and he coughed for a long time. Then he just knelt in the ashes. He raised his face to the paling day. Are you there? He whispered. Will I see you at the last? Have you a neck by which to throttle you? Have you a heart? Expletive, you eternally. Have you a soul? Oh God, he whispered. Oh God. Now, later on in the book, anger against God becomes a denial of the existence of God altogether. This father and son meet up with someone who calls himself Eli, E-L-Y. Is that short for Eliyahu Hanavi or Eli HaKohen? Or is it some play on one of the names of God? It's unclear. But this person tells them, quote, there is no God, and we are his prophets, end quote. Belief itself seems to have been swept away by the cataclysm. The metaphor here of continuing to trudge along a road to nowhere. Quote, on this road, McCarthy writes, there are no God-spoke men. They are gone, and I am left, and they have taken with them the world, end quote. And the challenge of living, continuing to live, is strictly about some kind of a secularized or faux spirituality in a dialogue between the father and his son toward the end of the book. You have to carry the fire. I don't know how to. Yes, you do. Is the fire real? The fire? Yes, it is. Where is it? I don't know where it is. Yes, you do. It's inside you. It always was there. I can see it. Here is a description of spirituality without God. Instead of Shlomo HaMelech's Ner Hashem Nishmat HaAdam that I wrote to you about last week in the Joshua for Parshat Bereshit, in the book of Mishlei, when he writes, the candle of Hashem is the soul of a human being. Here, there's just a fire. The fire has nothing to do with God. This is a pagan impulse. And this is the book, The Road. In our decade past, in 2014, was a book written by Emily St. John Mandel called Station 11. This book won the highest award for science fiction literature, apparently, in the United Kingdom, the Arthur C. Clarke Award. Now, this book resonated a little more for me when I read it. It's a book about a flu fact, a deadly pandemic that is so virulent and so fast in its spread that it kills off most of humanity. How's that for an uplifting story? But the uplifting part, the salvific element, if you will, is that it tells the story of a traveling symphony, which is actually a troupe of musicians and actors who are going from one group of people along the area of the Great Lakes, coincidentally, putting on Shakespearean plays and playing music for them. In this book, culture is the salvation. It's not religion, but culture as a form of spirituality. Where is God in this book? Oh, God is in the book, but he's in the mouth of wackos. No better word for it. The story of a concurrent story of a boy who reads a religious text and soon grows into a man who calls himself only the prophet and works as a cult leader with all of its nefarious trappings. His followers make their name by stealing property and people, adding them to the caravan like animals in a menagerie or maybe in some kind of a strange teva. And he's the only one who references our Parshat Shavua in these two books. The flu, the prophet said. The great cleansing that we suffered 20 years ago, that flu was our flood. The light we carry within us is the ark that carried Noah and his people over the face of the terrible waters. And I submit that we were saved, his voice rising, not only to bring the light, to spread the light, but to be the light. We were saved because we are the light. We are the pure. And just like I described in last week's drasha that I wrote you the summary of this past week, here we go again with the light. Anybody who thinks that they are only the light means they've absolved themselves from any responsibility. They have deified themselves as a human being. But as we know, homo deus is also a form of avodah zarah, of idolatry. Again, instead of the fire, now it's the light within. And there's no reference to God otherwise in this book. Contrast those two stories, both written within the last 20 years by a largely secular culture, or at least secular authors, with Parshat Noach. Parshat Noach tells us some crucial pieces of information that we ought to take with us now, through our time. It is not the same time as the Mabul, but there is a certain global quality to what we're going through, of course, and a certain sense of uncertainty about what comes next. Noach and his family survive. Righteousness survives. Belief in Hashem survives. V'yomer Hashem leNoach, bo ata v'chol bitcha lateva, ki otcha ra'iti tzadik lefanai bador hazeh. Hashem says to Noach just before the flood, come in, you and your household, to the teva, to the ark, because I've seen you righteous before me in this generation. 120 years, Noach was very lonely building that teva. Breshit Rabbah describes that for all 120 shekol kuf chaf shana, haya Noach notea arazim v'kotzitzan, he planted and then cut down cedar trees in order to build the ark. Amru, they said to him, Lama Kadain, why are you doing this? Amar Lohon, he said to them, Kach Amar Mari de Alma. So said the master of the universe, who mighty Mabula al Alma, he's going to bring a flood upon the earth. Well, they heap scorn upon him, and they say there isn't going to be a flood except upon your own household. So the first thing is, Parshat Noach reminds us that Noach believed in Hashem, and that Noach was righteous, and that he survived. That's the first thing. Number two, we know why the flood happened. The Torah tells us why it happened. It's not a mystery. And the earth became corrupted before God, and the earth was filled up with violence. And God saw the world, that it had become corrupted, that all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And God said to Noach, Kates kol basar balafanai. The end of all flesh has come before me. Ki mal'ah aretz chamas. The earth is filled with violence, mipnehem, on their account. Binani mashchitam et haaretz. I'm going to destroy the world. The Ramban points out, based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin, shalav itchatem gzar dinam, with regard to the violence and the thievery. That's why their decree was sealed. And the reason is v'atam mipnei shehu mitzvah muskelet, because not stealing is actually something that very logically, rationally, one can understand. We'd call this today a natural morality. Ein lehem bat tzorach lenavi mazhir. It didn't require a prophet to keep warning them about it. Ve'od, and further, shu ra'al shamayim v'labriot, also that it is evil against heaven and against humanity. The Chizkuni says that you may fairly ask, why were these people punished? They weren't commanded, after all, directly by God about these mitzvot. And he answers, Yesh kama mitzvot shechayavim b'nei adam lishamran mikoch sfar hadat. There's certain mitzvot that a human being is obligated to keep. Why? Because it makes sense. Why? Because of natural morality, a basic understanding of natural morality. Afapi shlom mitztavu, even though they were not commanded in any overt or direct sense. Ufichach, and therefore, nenshu, therefore they were punished. And he uses the example, Kimo Cain, just like Cain, who could have used as his easy defense. But Master of the Universe, I didn't know murder was wrong. But why didn't he say that? Because he knew the truth. And we know the truth. As we're living through this period now, we also learn something from Parshat Noach that we should think about in this time. It's what Chazal teach us about the Sheva Mitzvot B'nei Noach, that all of humanity, and not just the Jewish people, all of humanity, in a universal sense, we're all the descendants of Noach, commanded with 7 mitzvot. And these 7 mitzvot, the first 6 of them, according to the Rambam, Hilchot Melachim, Perek Tet, were already commanded to Adam Harishon. Al Shisha Dvarim nitztaveh Adam Harishon. Al Avodah Zarah, Val Birkat Hashem, against idolatry and against blaspheming God's name. Val Shvichut Damim, with regard to murder. Val Gilui Arayot, with regard to sexual immorality in its various forms. Val Hagezon, with regard to thievery in its various forms. Val Hadinim, with regard to a civil law, putting in a court system in order to maintain a basic sense of justice in the society. And the 7th, added in the time of Noach, when he comes out of the Teva, of Ever Minachai, not to eat flesh from a living creature. As we are experiencing once again and reading through the Parsha of Noach, we learn here not only about cataclysm and catastrophe, but also in between the lines about the values of what it means to be a righteous person, regardless of what the world does, of holding fast to one's values and to recognize that belief can make it through. In fact, does make it through. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu holds the world to account, but also that indeed humanity has the capacity for universal redemption, an ability to be among those who share a portion of the world to come. The Rambam writes this in Hilchot Melachim in Perek Chet, Halacha Yud Aleph. Kol Mekabel Sheva Mitzvot, anyone who accepts upon themselves the 7 commandments, when he's harlas sotan and is careful to fulfill them, Harizah michasidi umot ha'olam, v'yesh lo chelek ulam haba. That individual is from the righteous among the nations, and they have a portion in the world to come. And that's something those are some themes that we should think about during Parshat Noach and moving forward. We're living through a very challenging time. There's so much uncertainty, such a feeling of vulnerability. And at the same time, we have a story that reminds us that even though we may not be prophets, and we have no idea that we can figure out prophetically why HaKadosh Baruch Hu has sent us this global challenge, we know this: it is not meaningless. And if we can't tease out all of the global reasons, we can at least ask ourselves, how do we want to respond? As a nation, as a community, as families, and as individuals. How will we enrich our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and our relationship with others, following suit in all of the ethics and the morals that are taught to us by the values of our Torah HaKadosha, and encouraging the world and recognizing that the entire world, regardless of their religion or of their faith, we are all responsible for the Zion mitzvot b'nei Noach, the 7 Noachide laws, and that we ought to try to project these into the public square. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.